This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is brought to you by Berkeley, publisher of Carol Stiver's debut novel, The Mother Code. James Rollins raves, "Some stories are so unique, yet so universal, that it is a wonder they aren't a part of the human fable already. Carol Stiver's The Mother Code is such a novel. Learn more over at carolstivers.com.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 428 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be reviewing the new movie Vivarium and discussing other examples of suburban horror. And this will involve spoilers for Vivarium, and may also include spoilers for other books and movies that we discuss, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by three guests. So first up, we've got Grady Hendrix, making his 21st appearance on the show. He's the author of nonfiction books such as Paperbacks from Hell, and novels such as My Best Friend's Exorcism and the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. He also worked as a screenwriter on the recent movies Satanic Panic and Mohawk. So Grady, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Then next up, we've got Anthony Ha, making his 20th appearance on the show. He covers media, advertising, and pop culture for TechCrunch, where he also hosts the podcast Original Content. A chapbook of his short stories called Love Songs for Monsters was published by Youth in Decline in 2014, and his short story Late Train appeared in the February 2019 issue of Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet. So Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, and I'm excited to be breathing down Grady's neck.
And also joining us today is Lisa Yaszek, making her 5th appearance on the show. She's Regents Professor of Science Fiction Studies at Georgia Tech, and author of the nonfiction books Galactic Suburbia, Sisters of Tomorrow, and The Future is Female. She also recently appeared in the AMC miniseries James Cameron's Story of Science Fiction. So Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thanks, it's great to be back.
And today's show is brought to you by The Mother Code, the debut novel by Carol Stivers. And here's a description of the book. It says, "The year is 2049. When a deadly biowarfare agent spreads out of control, scientists must scramble to ensure the survival of the human race by placing genetically engineered children inside large-scale robots to be incubated, birthed, and raised by machines. Kai is born in America's desert southwest. His only companion, his robotic mother, Rosie. But as children like Kai come of age, their mothers transform too, in ways that were never predicted. And when government survivors decide that the mothers must be destroyed, Kai is faced with a choice. Will he fight to save the only parent he has ever known?" Karen Joy Fowler writes, "Stiver's wonderful story settles right on the line between human and machine, as blame and threat and rescue and love shift from character to character in surprising and powerful ways." And Shannon McGuire calls the book brilliant, innovative, and moving. So again, the book is called The Mother Code by Carol Stivers, and you can learn more over at carolstivers.com. All right, so now let's get to our panel. Okay, so we're going to start off and talk about this movie Vivarium. I don't know how well known this movie is. I just came across it in the iTunes store and thought it looked interesting. So I'm just curious, had anyone else heard of this movie at all before I emailed you guys about it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It got a small release, I think, right before lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
So what was your, Grady, what were your expectations going in?
Low. Although it does have Imogen Poots in it, and I love saying her name.
Yeah, so it stars Imogen Poots and Jesse Eisenberg, who are, I think, terrific actors. Yeah. So I think that's probably the main thing that got me to watch it. How about, Lisa, what were your expectations going in?
So I was actually really intrigued, and I remember being intrigued when I first saw the ads when it came out back in the spring. And what got me was there's the scene that they show in the trailer where the couple are in bed and the kid comes in and starts that insane screaming and they both flip him off. And I just remember my husband and I looked at each other and said, wow, that's like the first 4 years of parenthood condensed into 1 minute. And so I was kind of intrigued to see where it was going to take that.
Yeah, so let me just, I guess, explain. And so actually, Anthony, had you heard of this at all?
I had. At some point, I'd stumbled on the trailer, and I'm a fan of both Jesse Eisenberg and Imogen Poots, and had read either reviews maybe from the UK release or maybe a festival release, and I remember all the reviews were very negative, and so I had sort of the trailer I thought was good, and then I was like, oh, I guess it's pretty bad. We'll see if I ever watch it.
Really? Huh? Because, in the trailer that I watched, it has the Rotten Tomatoes score kind of soaring up to 89% or something, and it says as of some date. And then when I actually watched the movie, I looked at the Rotten Tomato score, and it had fallen down to like 72% or something. So I guess they got that.
I think when I said there was really only a handful of at least U.S. publications that review it. I think this was probably before a lot of the Rotten Tomatoes stuff had come in.
But so I guess they got that trailer out just in time to
technically accurate trailer.
Right.
But
I did notice that the reviews, because I looked at reviews too, and I noticed that they got people seemed to be increasingly interested in it, like the longer we were in lockdown. and so I think people were seeing that sort of connection about not necessarily the horror of the suburbs, but simply the horror of being trapped in a house you can't leave.
Yeah, there are a lot of weird. I mean, this movie obviously was, written and filmed and everything before any of the lockdown stuff, but there's a lot of synchronicity,
Yes.
But yeah, let me just explain the premise. So the premise is that there's a young couple and they go with a real estate agent to look at a house in this odd subdivision where all the units are all identical. And then as they're looking around this unit, the real estate agent, who's very, very odd, disappears, and they find that they're kind of trapped in this time-space bubble where they can't leave this subdivision. And then a box shows up on their sidewalk with a baby inside, and the box says, "Raise the child and be released." And so they have to raise this weird baby who grows up very quickly and is obviously some younger version somehow of the real estate agent. So Grady, what were your you said your expectations were super low. So what were kind of your initial reactions?
Well, I couldn't get over my feeling that this was sort of like Mark Zuckerberg's inner life. Like, it's like, I'm this cool guy and but then I have to go live in this house in the suburbs with like a woman who's like married to me or something. And then there's a baby that appears and she wants to be its mother and like nothing fun happens and the baby's not fun and no one's fun. And I just want to dig my hole. I just want to go dig my hole or build my Facebook. Why can't they just leave me alone to dig my hole? Because
Jesse Eisenberg played Mark Zuckerberg in The Social Network. So that was where my head was the entire time, is looking at this as like a stylized image, abstract journey, like the Jodorowsky version of Zuckerberg's inner life. But I also thought it was interesting that normally a lot of the suburban stuff we see in pop culture, like I'm thinking of like books like the Stepford Wives or shows like Mad Men, seem to think that the suburbs are pretty sweet for dudes, but like for women, they're like death traps. And I thought it was interesting this posited the suburb as a death trap that was sort of like, it's bad for men and women. It's a unisex death trap. Well, I guess, Lisa, do you want to jump in there? What do you think about Grady's perception that in general movies depict the suburbs as good for men and negative for women?
I think that historically that's absolutely been true. And for instance, I as I mentioned to some of you, to all of you actually, when we were prepping for the show, I know from my own research that in the 1950s, women who were writing science fiction, this was absolutely one of their favorite topics, was the horror of suburban life for women. And then, of course, Ira Levin, who wrote Stepford Wives, is sort of laddering off that moment in science fiction history. And I think taking that insight that you really see women talking about more than men in the 1950s and 60s. And then, he writes it large in that film in the 1970s. And that makes sense, of course, if you think about the time period, right? Because in the 1950s and 60s and even the 70s, it was really women who were on point in the home, men that left the home every day to go to work. Whereas women, that was their domain and that was where they were at. So I think it makes sense that historically we've seen the suburbs as being more of a trap for women because they've been there longer. But as time progresses and as men become more involved in the home and in domesticity in general, I think it's no surprise that for men also the suburbs would then become a place of perhaps excitement, but perhaps terror as well.
What did you think, Lisa, of these characters, Tom and Gemma? How did they strike you?
I liked them actually a lot. And again, I think it was because in so many ways, the movie felt like, again, like I said, the first 4 years of parenthood condensed into all the bad moments and none of the good moments. And what was interesting to me is, right, that in some ways, this is certainly a science fiction horror movie. It's all about what if, right, there really were these cuckoo like aliens who could ensnare us and force us to raise their kids. But to me, what was kind of most interesting was that it didn't feel like science fiction for much of it. It felt like realism, not in the suburban part, but in terms of the interpersonal relations and the way those people reacted. Like, for instance, and like I said, again, I was watching this with my husband, and the scene where Jesse Eisenberg just gets sick of the kid and locks him in the car, and they're both in the house, and the kid is screaming and screaming and screaming, and then finally the woman breaks, and she's just like, screw you, I've got to go get him. We were like, wow, that was every night of Cry It Out for us for years and years and years. And it just felt too real. So we sort of enjoyed it because it felt so real. We were kind of impressed. We assumed someone somewhere on that production must have raised a child at some point.
Yeah, I guess we should explain too that so this kid who's growing up very quickly is also super odd and just screams at the top of his lungs if he doesn't get what he wants.
That's not the odd part, because kids do that.
And sort of imitates their voices in a very creepy way.
Yeah.
And even his normal voice is a dubbed voice, at least while he's still a child.
Yeah, it's really weird.
So Anthony, what did you think of the characters?
I thought they were, to a certain extent, blanks, intentionally so, that you could sort of project yourself into. And that was mostly fine. I wouldn't necessarily say that either of them made a particularly strong impression. And I mean, I guess Jesse Eisenberg in particular, I think there's certain aspects of his character where he's playing an against type because he's this more of like a manual laborer versus Mark Zuckerberg. But at the same time, he still acts in a lot of the same ways. And so it felt like there was they were playing a Jesse Eisenberg type and an Imogen Poots type, and they were both fine at it. And you could believe their reactions when they were put into that situation, that the whole time, I think there's a certain point where he starts to become really obsessed with digging the hole, which I think is still compelling, but feels less relatable. But for so much else of it, you just think, okay, that makes sense as the behavior I would have in that situation.
Yeah, let's explain that. So the Jesse Eisenberg character, they have food delivered, but the food has no taste and there's nothing really for them to do. And at some point he has his last couple cigarettes that he brought with him, and he tosses one into the grass in the front yard, and it's sort of like the grass kind of disappears into a little patch of dirt, and he gets the idea to start digging and see if he can dig his way out of this, this bubble universe trap that they're in. I wasn't exactly sure what was going on at that part where the grass kind of blinked out of existence. Is there anything more to explain, or is that just sort of weird and unexplained?
I thought the cigarette
I just think it was
burned it.
Yeah.
Didn't it? I thought the cigarette just burned the grass away.
But it seemed to happen really fast.
It was accelerated, yeah.
It's a kind of magical movie,
Yeah, I just think it was a stylized choice.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too.
So Grady, do you have any other thoughts on Jesse Eisenberg's character in this movie?
One of the things that I didn't like about this movie is it had really reductive kind of like gendered roles. And maybe it was supposed to, right? Like maybe that was like, oh, the suburbs brings it out of you. But, her immediate reversion to mothering the kid and his immediate reversion to, I'm going to leave the house and work. That to me was like kind of the least interesting part of it. Like I wish they'd flipped that a little bit. Because really at the end of the day, this is almost like, it's less of a movie with like sort of a story and conflict and more of, to me at least, it was more of a nature film. Like here is the life cycle of this animal, which was interesting, but it was missing a lot of the things I would expect in a movie telling a story, but it had a lot of the things I'd want in a nature documentary.
I love that idea that it's a nature documentary. I think that feels just right. And to me, that makes sense of like what Anthony is saying about the characters feeling like blanks and my own ability to just sort of dump my own hopes and fears into it, right?
Right.
It's like, it's just these forms, right? And you even get that when she finds the book at the end and there's just like this generic man and a generic woman and a generic little guy. And I feel like that genericness was almost the point.
Yeah.
Right. Is that the suburbs turn us into these sort of parodies of heterosexual normativity,
Yeah.
And,
But that's always this thing that I find really interesting about suburban angst movies and books that I think was really on display with this one, because the reassuring message of all of them is no, 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 you're not boring. The place you live in is boring. You're being made boring. You're picking these things you're doing. Oh, you're doing just like your parents. You've got a job and your wife is home taking care of the kids and you live in a house. That's not your choice. That was imposed on you by the architecture and the landscape around you. So it's very reassuring, right? Like, oh, I'm not boring. The world around me is what's making me boring.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that idea, obviously, throughout this panel of sort of, is this movie, fair to the suburbs, or is it saying anything original about the suburbs? But sticking with just the plot of the movie for the moment, I think it's very clearly divided kind of into three acts, where there's sort of, the early stages where they're kind of like figuring out what's going on, and then the second stage where they're kind of unraveling, and then the third stage where, the climactic events all kind of happen. And I actually thought, so the second act ends where the Imogen Poots character is kind of starting to mother the child. And there's a scene which I actually thought was kind of the most interesting scene in the movie, where they're looking up at the clouds. And she says, what does this cloud look like? And he says, it looks like a cloud, because all the clouds in this weird fake reality that they're in just look like generic clouds. They don't have any distinctive features. And she sort of looks at him at some point and says, you're a mystery and I'm going to solve you, or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like, the Jesse Eisenberg character is becoming the villain, and sort of the allegiances between the characters are shifting.
Mm-hmm.
And then I felt like that thread kind of got dropped, and the ending that we got in the third act I found perfectly satisfactory, but it didn't blow me away. And I was left with the feeling that there was some more interesting ending involving, delving deeper into these characters somehow, that was kind of left on the table.
Yeah, I see your point, because that to me was also really interesting, was the moment it started to become kind of Oedipal, right? Like, and the kid is 11 or 12 too. So right at that sort of classic moment when it's supposed to be happening, but the way there's that battle between the two men for the female lead's attention, and like even things like you said, Dan, like where she like takes his hand and they're both staring, kind of glaring at the husband who's being kind of a jerk and slinking out of the house. And that was an interesting moment, I thought. And I wanted to see more of that as well. I was surprised when it dropped.
Yeah, and she says, I'm going to solve you or whatever, and doesn't really,
No, she doesn't, and that was annoying too.
we sort of get, it all comes full circle, which is fine, but we don't really learn anything particularly that we didn't already know or didn't already assume.
Yeah, one thing I thought was really a missed opportunity with this movie was the passage of time. Like, there was that great scene early on when they're climbing across the backyards and you see the sun going down and they're getting sweatier and more exhausted and going through the motions. But when they're living in the house, like, you really feel like their awareness is kind of the movie's awareness, like all those years, all those days just feel like one day. All those years feel like about 94 minutes. I was really interested that neither of them aged. Like, I wasn't quite sure how long it took that kid to age, because he seemed to grow. 100 days total. 100
days. You had to watch what they were marking when they were measuring.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
It's all there. So he grew about, so we figured it out. He was growing a year every 10 days.
Got it. So wait, so even after he became like a young adult, was still within the 100 days? Okay. Yeah, because that was what I was trying to figure out, is sort of like, well, I got the impression it was a couple of years, but 100 days makes a lot more sense. And I retract my comment.
Yeah, it was 100 days up till when he's like 10 or 11, when he's at that tweenie age. And
yeah, right.
I assume it's just another 100 days until he hits like 20. So I assume it's less than a year.
Okay.
Yeah, well, because
I just assumed he'd keep growing at the same rate, given that we see that on that chart, and it's very consistent when you look at that hash marks.
Well,
you use reason and math.
To dig that hole, and it doesn't take years to dig that hole, right? It takes.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't use reason. I used experience. We have one of those growth charts on our wall too.
I want to get Anthony back in here. Anthony, what do you think about what I'm saying about the third act of the story?
It's interesting because I think I enjoyed the third act more than you did, but I do sort of agree that in some ways it feels like a fairly straightforward and expected ending to the movie we've already gotten, rather than complicating things in any particularly interesting way. And I guess if I had a complaint that isn't exactly the same complaint but feels related to me, is that it felt like the right ending if it had been a short story or maybe an hour-long episode for an anthology show or something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas as a whole, the ending, the sort of straightforwardness of the ending reinforced my sense of this is a really interesting idea, maybe not quite enough for a 90-minute film.
Yeah, well, so when you say that you liked the ending more, what was it about it that you liked?
I liked the scene. I know that we were talking about how she doesn't really get to solve the mystery, but where she goes under the sidewalk and we just have this sort of horrific descent through all these different worlds and all these different, or I guess really flashbacks to other people who've been trapped in the same situation. And it was something where it didn't necessarily reveal a lot that you didn't suspect already, and almost nothing that was spelled out in that scene, but I found it just really satisfying and scary on its own. And I also really appreciated or enjoyed the very final scene where, again, it's exactly pretty much what you expected. The now fully grown, I assume, alien arrives at the real estate office where the real estate agent is now very old and dying and basically dies right there. But there are like all these really nice touches where he folds him up in this really disgusting way and puts him into the body bags that we're familiar with and sits down and, you know, waits for the next customer. And there's just this really nice feeling of both eeriness and symmetry. And so even though I completely expected that to be the ending, it completely worked for me.
That's interesting that you thought that she was, when she's traveling through the different, you know, houses with the different colored filters on them. You said you think that those were previous occupants of the same house, or because I thought that they were, you know, somehow that lots of different people were being ensnared all at once, and she was traveling through.
I assumed it was just revealing that there are many people who've been trapped in this sort of same cycle of having to raise this sort of cuckoo alien, and that this real estate, that both this surreal development and the real estate agency have been there through many life cycles of, I don't know, maybe just the one alien or maybe others. I don't know.
I assumed that as well. And I assumed that because when Jesse Eisenberg's character was digging the hole, right, like the point at which he dies, or the thing that happens right before he dies is he unearths another man who had clearly been through the same thing. So that sort of suggests that multiple people have lived in that same greenhouse, right?
Right, but I mean, the development seems like a new development, just in terms of the architecture and stuff. So I wouldn't have gotten the sense that, you know, years and years of people had gone. I don't know. Grady, you're going to have to.
Yeah, I actually had thought that, oh, these are the other houses and all that. But hearing Anthony and Lisa, I'm kind of like, oh, yeah, that makes a lot more sense, because if there are a lot of these aliens, then there must be a lot of these identical real estate offices all over the place. And that doesn't make any sense. And it does make more sense if this is one sort of It-like alien, you know, from Stephen King's It, that just keeps reproducing rather than a whole race of them living amongst us.
This is sort of just an interesting note. I listened to an interview with the director, and do you guys know about ghost estates, particularly in Ireland?
Oh, yeah.
So apparently, you know, like when there was a huge housing boom and they would build these huge, you know, they were just putting up developments really, really fast. And then you might find, and then I think the market sort of, you know, they produced more housing than there was a demand for. And so you might buy a unit in one of these estates and then find that, you know, there's 100 units and you're the only person living in this entire neighborhood. And that was kind of, I thought, really interesting, a part of the inspiration for this story.
Well, it was really interesting. Some ghost estates, too, like they would get the city money or the bond issue to lay in roads and a sewage system and fire hydrants and all that, and not get around to building the houses. They would go bankrupt before then. So it'd be subdivisions that are totally laid out, devoid of houses. And there's actually one in Charleston, where I am right now, where they built a model subdivision at the opening. It was about 3 blocks, and it was a scaled down version of what the subdivision would look like. So it was like, you know, 10 houses, but they were all slightly smaller. It was like the street, everything was just scaled down to sort of give you this idea of what it would all look like. And then the place went bankrupt. So all that was left on this massive, like hundreds of acre subdivision was this like mini dwarf subdivision that took up about 3 blocks.
Well, that seems like a horror story waiting to happen there.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I actually had a book I was trying to sell for a long time that was set because sometimes people would actually live in these ghost subdivisions to take care of them and to make sure like they weren't getting vandalized and stuff. So I had something like that, but no one was ever interested. I should have done it in Ireland.
See, Lisa, what did you think about Grady's suggestion to have swapped the gender roles and so have the woman digging the hole and the man being protective of the child?
I think that would certainly fulfill all of our progressive fantasies. But, I mean, the reality is I was just reading that it was something like 43% of all American men now sometimes participate in household cooking and cleaning, which means that 57% of American men are not doing it. So as much as, and things are changing, but they haven't changed 100%. And I think that pull towards that sort of traditional heterosexual sort of nuclear family like that is still pretty strong. And obviously like statistics prove that. So while I agree, it felt very, very conventional. I don't think that is entirely wrong, given that we live in one of the most progressive countries in the world in terms of gender relations. And we're still talking about the fact that it's really women and not men who are doing the homework or are doing second shift labor if they also have jobs. So, I think there's that. And so it didn't bother me that much. And I think another reason it didn't bother me that much was, again, when I'm thinking about the way the family dynamics work, one of the things that really surprised both me and my husband when we had a kid was that no matter how hard you fight, the entire world pushes for it to be the most conservative, normalized kind of family relationship possible. So, and it always means the mom is the one who takes care of the kid. So we do things like we tell my son's school never to call me at work and always to call my husband. And yet they'll call me, like I could be doing this podcast with you and they'll call me and they'll be like, your child needs you. And I'm like, why did you not call my husband who's at home? So I know I'm going on and on, but my point is here, I think that there are a lot of forces that still push towards that. So for me, I think the movie spoke truth to power relations right now in some ways.
Yeah. Well, and in additionally, you also had the aliens were kind of enforcing, like the aliens had traditional gender roles as well.
Right.
Well, and it's also not quite, the thing that was missing for me, I think, was not quite so much like a binary switch in the gender roles, but and I get it, like these guys are enslaved by an alien, unless you've like got a really specific like kink, that's always going to be rough. But there was this aspect of just the joylessness of it. And I know they have the scene where they dance in front of the car and all that, but it's like, there's this really interesting interview Stephen King gave once where he was talking about being at the University of Maine and how all his literature classes would decry the suburbs and how stifling they were and how terrible. And that this one young woman in one of the classes was very hesitantly said, well, because they were talking about how like, oh, it's just lawn darts and pool parties and barbecues and how like stifling and conformist that is. And she sort of hesitantly was like, well, that's how I grew up and I really liked it. And King remembers sitting there and feeling like a coward because he didn't have the courage to say, yeah, I kind of liked it too. Because there is an aspect to suburbia that's really, really appealing. Like they wouldn't have been built. They wouldn't be so popular if they weren't kind of lovely to some extent.
Well, see, I thought you were going to say that the student said, I grew up in an environment much worse than suburbia, to which suburbia seems like, most people on Earth, I think, would be happy to,
oh, yeah, totally.
Suburbia, But yeah, I want to get into that in just a second. But before we move on from Vivarium, does anyone have anything else, any other thoughts about this movie or any of the other directions they think it should have gone in or anything like that?
Yeah, actually one thing, and Anthony reminded me of this when he was speaking about the joylessness of it, is that I understand that the alien child, or at least the creepy child, was meant to be horrible and disturbing. But it seems to me what was so surprising is from the beginning, they were horrible to the child. And it's like, I kept thinking throughout the movie, maybe if you would like be nice to the kid for a minute, maybe the situation would shift a little bit or something. I felt like they got themselves stuck in this really antagonistic loop that wasn't doing anyone any good. And I really had some moment where at least, and maybe there was a scene where that got, on the cutting room floor where they tried to be kind to the child and were just met with more alienness and horror. But without that, it was that was like the one thing that kept bugging me was like, why don't you just try to be nice to it for a minute? Because in the few moments when they are nice to the child, like it's not as bad. It's not quite as creepy. And it just felt like they could have managed it a little better. That's my thinking.
Actually, Lisa, that's really interesting because, one of the things that makes me think about is what did the kid need them for? I mean, I get that it needs them from the time, like for about 20 days, from the time it's a baby till it can feed itself. But they're not teaching it anything. They're not really raising it. It can create this extra dimensional sort of like pocket universe. What does it need them for?
Right.
I thought that they were like socializing it, I mean, obviously not.
But Lisa's right, though. They're very nice. They're very mean to it.
Yeah.
But he's like learning like language from them.
Yeah, because he's always imitating what they say. And so I think to the degree that...
it's a cuckoo, right? So it literally imitates them. But
I think to the degree that Martin, the real estate agent, appears normal at all, it's to the extent of having grown up with human parents. I think
that makes sense.
In a house by himself, he wouldn't have even that semblance of normality.
I feel like this movie is also a good example of a tension that exists in a lot of fantastical work, where there's the tension between sort of the allegorical aspect and the more sort of the concrete world building aspect. So I think as an allegory, I find it really, really powerful. I admire the sort of purity of how much it's like, screw the suburbs, screw traditional family units. This is all a terrible death trap that you should avoid at all costs. I think, but then when you try to then, make logical sense of it, I think there's like a lot of interesting details, and it's not that they completely ignored that, but I think there is a certain thinness to it because they were so committed to the allegory.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, that's nice.
Well, I guess, I don't know. I mean, I felt like in this story, in contrast to some of the other ones that we're going to talk about, like Stepford Wives or Get Out, which are very clearly satirical, I'm not sure if I know what the filmmakers feel about suburbia or the nuclear family or whatever. I mean, this could just be a story about, it sucks to be abducted by aliens and is not necessarily saying anything about normal human society. I mean, I guess that sort of satirical thing didn't come through super clearly to me in this movie the way it does in some of the others.
Well, that's because there is no society in this movie. It's just them. There's no people. It's not even really a suburb, because suburbs are collections of people living in spaces, right? These are just houses. This is what I propose anyway. I mean, to me, when you think about the suburbs, right, when we talk about like the conformity or the blandness or this or that, what you're talking about are people, not objects. And so, that for me was the weird thing too. I'm like, is this about the suburbs? I don't know. Definitely about not wanting to be kidnapped by cuckoo aliens. I mean, that's like the one thing I can clearly say.
Well, it's funny, actually. One of the interviews I watched with the director, one of the audience comments was, "This movie made me realize I don't want to have kids," and he's like, "No, you can have kids because I don't think that's the intended message, Although
that's the received message. No, that's the received message for sure.
Yeah.
But that's interesting that wasn't the intention. Did he want it to be about the suburbs?
He was, I think from what I remember, I'm trying to remember exactly what he said, but he talked a lot about the these ghost estates, and I think he was more talking about sort of economic exploitation and class issues and people being trapped in houses they can't afford and stuff like that. You should go actually watch the actual thing. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think his concerns were more sort of class oriented than anything else.
Oh, I think if you read it through a class lens, that helps make a lot of sense of it. And I also think it makes more sense of the gender roles, I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it's good to know.
Anthony, any final thoughts on Vivarium?
No, I mean, I didn't think I had thought it was a little thin, but overall, I'm glad I saw it, and I probably wouldn't have watched it without having to do it for this episode. So everyone should go check it out.
Yeah, I found it quite enjoyable. I mean, all the movies that I watched for this, I thought were quite good. And yeah, it's just like a Twilight Zone episode, which I like. I mean, maybe it should have been an hour long rather than 90 minutes long, but I would definitely recommend it. I mean, it's got enough going for it in terms of, good acting and interesting visuals and everything that sort of an intriguing premise, creepy atmosphere and everything that I would definitely check it out. All right, but I guess I'll just say, so the movies that I watched / rewatched for this were, I mentioned, Vivarium, The Stepford Wives, Get Out, The Burbs, which is a 1989 horror comedy starring Tom Hanks, and the 1956 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is, I think, the original black and white version. And so, Anthony, you said that you just rewatched Invasion of the Body Snatchers, right? So what was it like going back and watching that?
Well, I guess part of it, I was watching it through the lens of, is this suburban? Because I know that on our email planning thread, Grady was like, I remember that being more urban. And so and it wasn't, because we also talked about this question of what makes something suburban horror? Because there are a lot of horror movies that happen to be set in the suburbs, but that's not necessarily intrinsic to their identities. And in fact, I mean, certainly Body Snatchers has been, the 70s remake was set in San Francisco. And so there is something about the story that I think it doesn't necessarily rely on being in the suburbs, but there is something very specific about the effect in the 50s version where it's all these people that he knows who are, I guess I'm spoiling the 70-year-old movie or 65-year-old movie, but all these people are being replaced by pod people. And so the fact that it's a doctor in this community and everyone knows everyone, and that's part of the horror, that that my uncle is acting very strangely and everyone else can look at them and say, no, that's the person I know. But then there's this gradual feeling of wrongness. And so I found it to still be a very effective, just genuinely creepy and exciting all the way through. I mean, I know that there's a lot of political readings of the film that have less to do with suburbs and more to do with communism and things like that. But I think it uses the suburban setting very well.
Yeah, let me lay out. So I was thinking of suburban horror in terms basically of two criteria. And one is the movie deals somehow thematically with the suburbs enforcing some sort of conformity or loss of individuality on people who inhabit them. And then also movies where everything seems nice and normal, but there are dark secrets that your neighbors are up to or they're out to get you or something. And that's where the horror comes from. So that's kind of what I was thinking of in terms of suburban horror. I don't know if anyone has, are there any other things that people think should be added to those two?
I would just say they take it, to me, suburban horror takes place in a landscape that's completely residential. There is no commercial zone. And everyone there in that residential area is same class and generally same ethnicity.
Okay. Well, I guess that excludes Invasion of the Body Snatchers because we do see a downtown commercial area.
Yeah, but I also feel like that really, I mean, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I mean, the reason it's been remade 7 billion times is because it's that very resonant thing, they look like people, but they're not people. They're the people but they're, it's that idea of little boxes, right? The folk song, everyone's all ticky-tacky, everyone's sort of blandly and shallowly happy and peaceful, but really they've given up some essential part of themselves. And that's always been, I feel like, part of the root of suburban horror.
Yeah, and as Anthony's saying, it's hard to watch Invasion of the Body Snatchers 1956 without thinking of communism and the Red Scare and everything. I don't actually know off the top of my head if Jack Finney intended that or not.
Not at all. He actually pushed back hard on that interpretation.
Yeah, he did.
Oh.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, Lisa, do you want to...
Yeah. Oh, I was just gonna say, I'd heard the same thing. He pushed back. And in fact, the great thing about that movie, it's a container. You can drop in whatever fears you want. Like,
Yeah.
the most brilliant reading I've ever seen of that film is that it's actually about the danger of industrial factory farming and the transformation of nutrition.
That's great.
It actually reads really well, especially those last scenes with the pods and the trucks going back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Well, it's also, it's one of the interesting things because, the book is also very different from the original movie even. Like at the book at the end, the pods are like, these humans, they fight too much. They're too contrary. And then they like fly off they like levitate off into space. It's kind of goofy. But also the other thing though, I actually saw a read of it because I think that industrial farming is really interesting. I saw someone with a read on it that was like, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is the most immature fantasy ever because it's basically people saying no one's allowed to change. If someone's different, it's because they're taken over and they're a pod person.
oh, that's great. I love that reading.
Yeah, I was like, wow, because I really like almost every iteration of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, especially the Philip Kaufman one. But like, I was like, ooh, yeah, they are really immature.
Actually, let me bring in the Burbs into that because the premise of the Burbs is that Tom Hanks he lives on this residential street where everyone knows each other, and he's taking the week off from work and has decided to just sit around the house. And he becomes, he and a bunch of other residents become obsessed with the idea that the strange new neighbors who are vaguely, who keep to themselves and are vaguely sort of Eastern European are, cannibal, Satan cult type people. And as I said, it's sort of mostly a comedy, but with horror elements. But this idea of, targeting people or sort of applying additional scrutiny to people because they're different, the movie deals with very directly, and kind of like twists. There's a couple twists related to that, which I guess I'll just spoil. But so basically, at the end, as a result of all their investigations, they've blown up the neighbor's house, and Tom Hanks gives this huge speech about how, we're the real monsters. They're just a little bit different, we're the ones who like destroyed their house and everything. But then it turns out there's an extra twist and they really are cannibal killers. So I've always thought that the Burbs, I saw this when I was a kid and I always thought it had the right number of twists, that, because it's kind of a play on Hitchcock's Rear Window, which I always thought was in need of a few more twists. So I don't know, do people have any thoughts on the Burbs or this idea of, people being, the suburbanites having suspicion of people who are different or anything like that?
Well, one of the things that's interesting with the Burbs is, to me, it really highlights one of the things with suburban horror that I find really interesting, which is, so there's this idea that a lot of things in the world are supposed to be labor saving and give us more free time, right? Like computers and labor saving devices and factories and all this stuff. It's supposed to give us all this free time. And so a lot of this suburban horror, I think, and not even like the realistic suburban horror, right? Like stuff like Richard Yates' Revolutionary Roads to some extent, Mad Men to a large extent, John Cheever's, some of his stuff a little bit, but it's like, so what happens with all that free time? Like, what do we do with it? And for some people, it's like, oh, well, we get drunk or we pop pills but the Burbs puts this thing out that I think is sort of the dark side of America, which is with all that free time, we form a lynch mob. Like we decide that someone's the enemy and we turn on them. We have a satanic panic. It's one of the things I always think is really interesting is during the satanic panic, one of the big pushbacks against it and rightly so, but I thought it was a weird angle to take is it's just a bunch of bored housewives with too much time on their hands. They're imagining Satan everywhere. This idea that like if you have enough free time, you're just going to start rounding people up and killing them. And that's the whole thing with the Burbs. Tom Hanks takes a vacation and he can't handle the free time. He has to do something with it. So what does he do? He's a red-blooded American male. He decides that these other people are different and dangerous and need to be destroyed.
Mm-hmm. See, Anthony, did you ever see The Burbs?
I saw it as a kid, but didn't have time to rewatch it for this episode, so I remember almost nothing.
You weren't like, Mom, Dad, it's about lynching.
I think I do remember the extra twist at the end and being vaguely disquieted by it, but other than that, I couldn't. I think my only other response was I remember it being much more comedic than it sounds like it might have been.
It's really funny.
It's pretty comedic. I'd actually,
Okay.
I remembered it pretty well, I thought, but I had totally forgotten the satanic panic aspect of it. So it was kind of, weird. I had totally forgotten that it played into that whole thing.
And was made during the satanic panic or towards the end of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting just listening to Grady talk about like the issue with labor-saving devices and how these make us more bored. And I'm interested that all of the literary and filmic examples you gave were by men because, as you may know, ever since Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, I mean, feminist researchers have amply demonstrated that the labor-saving devices, and I'm saying those with air quotes around it, that are brought into the home actually radically increase the amount of domestic labor that certainly women do and probably men as well when they're at home. So prior to the advent of at-home washing machines, women spent maybe a couple hours a week dealing with washing. But once they came, like now we spend, it's like 15 to 25 hours a week doing laundry. So, so I find it interesting, this whole idea that somehow the suburbs leave you with free time. Because in my experience, if you ever talk to any housewife or house husband, they don't have any free time. They are constantly cooking and cleaning and doing all those other things to keep up the suburban dream, right? So I don't know.
But there's actually a key, right? Which is that, because I agree with you. It's actually everything I said. It was definitely from a male point of view, but there's actually a key, which is that when women have free time, it's because they're outsourcing that labor. Do you know what I mean? And so it's like,
they're not outsourcing it. They're doing it at home.
No. They have help.
Right? I mean, that's
usually a Black or Hispanic person.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
When you're outsourcing it to other humans.
Yeah.
Okay,
so I'm saying, so actually, because I think what you're saying is really right. I mean, like, and I got to say, I wish we were talking more about The Feminine Mystique, because that is like a complete suburban horror story. There are quotes from that still like chill your blood. But there is a thing where women could have a domestic helper who then did give them free time, but now they've outsourced all the work the labor saving devices put on them to someone else. Like, it's a weird thing. It's like reducing human beings to the status of labor saving devices.
Well,
we've never done that to women of color, have we?
No, never, as far as I know.
Around a number of stories, and unfortunately, I only had time to read one of them. But
that's okay.
In terms of suburban horror written by women, do you want to just talk about why you chose those particular stories to? Yeah,
sure. So I had sent everyone a group of stories because, like I said, when women who were writing science fiction in the after World War II, so late 40s, 50s, early 60s. Often actually really very much strategically position themselves as housewives who were writing science fiction, and then often actually literally wrote about suburbia and the experience of being a housewife in suburbia. And I think this makes sense because it was a period in America, at least, when women were told, thanks for your labor in World War II. Now it's time for you to be a domestic patriot and go home and make the home safe for your family. And, and women did that. And I'm sure women had lots of different experiences. But as we know from The Feminine Mystique, lots of women did find this to be a rather horrifying experience in the long run. And it turns out like plenty of women were writing about that in fiction before Betty Friedan got to it in journalism. So I had just wanted to give you guys a range of stories that really show how women have been thinking it through from a variety of different perspectives for at least 65 years.
Well, let me just read the ones you sent so people can look them up. So we've got The Heat Death of the Universe by P.A. Zoline.
That's Pamela Zoline, yeah.
Cynosure by Kit Reed. Wives by Lisa Tuttle. Created He Them by Alice Eleanor Jones. And The Wild Wood by Mildred Klingerman. And I had recommended also The Neglected Garden by Kathy Koja that you said you actually teach in your classes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. Students love that story. They're really disturbed by it.
Yeah, I read that probably, 15 years ago or something. I don't know when it came out, but it's really 92. Stuck with me all this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay, I didn't realize it was that old.
Yeah, it's actually quite old.
Grady, did you recommended some books too, right?
Probably.
Well, no, I have it here. So, The House
Oh.
Next Door by Anne Rivers Siddons.
Oh, yeah.
Let's Go Play at the Adams, and The Happy Man by Eric C. Higgs.
Yeah, although The Happy Man, I mean, I really feel like it's more sort of like suburban decadent swingers and sort of plus the Marquis de Sade ending in like cannibalism. So I don't think it fits in with where we are. But The House Next Door, definitely. I mean, a peaceful Atlanta suburb where just a house happens. Well, it's weird because when you read it, the house just is built. It's a new house, but it's built wrong, so it's evil. But when you kind of take it at face value, it's evil because it's modern architecture in a suburban neighborhood that's everyone's like got these like sort of like older homes. So maybe that's the problem. One thing I want to say is I thought Lisa's recommendations, the thing I loved about them is so many of them, the style mirrors the content. Like definitely Created He Them, and I can't remember, there was another one that Wives was the other one, that both start out as, oh, this seems like a normal suburban life, and then slowly these small disquieting details emerge, and then you wind up in just some radically horrendous place. But that's sort of the pattern of a suburban horror movie, right? It looks normal, and then you look closer and it's not.
Yeah,
you find an ear in a field.
Mm-hmm. That happens in that Mildred Klingerman story too, The Wildwood, which if anyone actually wants to listen to, you can go just find it on Escape Pod. There's a marvelous reading of it there. And it's the same thing because it starts out with a family going to get Christmas trees, like
be
happier and more joyful. And by the end, like it is such a morass of like just evilness.
Depravity.
So, yeah, absolute depravity.
I also wanted to ask you, Grady, you recommended the Stepford Wives novel by Ira Levin. And I've only seen the movie, but I read the synopsis of the novel, and it sounded like the ending is quite a bit different from the movie. And I was just wondering what you thought about the two.
Oh man, I cannot. I remember the end of the movie very clearly. The end of the book, Lisa, do you remember what happens at the end of the book?
I don't. It's been so long since I've read the book.
Yeah.
I teach the movie all the time, but I never teach the book.
Yeah, and the book's great. I really
well, okay,
Dave,
Ira, remind us what.
Yeah, what happens at the end, Dave?
Oh, I mean, I read the synopsis. I don't know if I could say exactly. I mean, certainly in the movie, it was much more clear that the robots were robots. I think there was something like somebody, like one of the characters runs outside, and then they're like, no, like, we're not robots, and they are like, stab us and see, or it was something like that. But yeah, I just read the synopsis a few days ago and just noticed right after watching the movie, and I was like, wow, this is so much different than the movie. But if nobody remembers it that well,
sorry,
we could move on.
The book's great. I mean, Ira Levin's such a good writer. It's been so long.
Yeah. See, Anthony, have you seen Stepford Wives?
I did. I watched it for the first time for this episode, which is, it's sort of one of the kind of cultural touchstones that I'd missed. And I have to say that I was not crazy about it. I thought like thematically it was really rich, and I thought all the performances were fine and individual scenes were mostly well done. But as a whole, I think it may just be this curse of, knowing the basic plot of the film, that made it really hard for me to watch because I just know the whole time, oh, right, they're replacing all the wives with robots. And then the whole movie is about sort of gradually building your awareness that's what's happening. So you just kind of want to be shouting at the television, like, no, it's robots. It's robots.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, we're talking about the original film from 1975.
Oh, thank God.
Which I just rewatched, and I think it's pretty great. I mean, the premise basically is, there's a woman who's a aspiring photographer, young mother living in New York City, is persuaded, sort of forced by her husband to move out to this wealthy suburb called Stepford, where there's this men's club that kind of runs everything in town, and they're replacing their wives with sort of pretty demure robot replacements. I thought it was a pretty great movie. And I also want to get into Get Out before we run out of time, because I thought that watching Get Out and Stepford Wives back to back, there were actually a lot of parallels between the two of them that I'd never thought about before. In both cases, you have the main character coming from the city to a wealthy suburb and being sort of an outsider and stumbling into a plot where their humanity or their individuality is being erased to serve the sinister purposes of the community.
And they're both photographers.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And both the movie, there's mind and body transfer stuff in both of them too, right? So
yeah.
Because
I think
in both cases, it's about taking these disruptive subjects, right? Like these feminist women and these sassy Black men who stand up for themselves, right? and reshaping them in these ways that make sense in terms of the suburbs. So yeah, quite a bit of parallels there.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me because one of the things I find is the weakness of Stepford Wives is that they're building robots. Like, I find the idea that, and then they're just going to get rid of the human. I mean, so much of that movie I love, and the book too. To me, it's so heartbreaking when she comes back and Paula Prentice is all robotic. It's just like, oh, you made a friend, and it's so hard to make a friend as an adult, and then they're like turned into a sex android. And we all know that feeling. But I always find it scarier when people are sort of reconfigured or choose to reconfigure to get along in a suburb. Like, I find the ending of Blue Velvet where you kind of feel like, it kind of reverts back to the opening imagery and you're like, they're just going to keep living there. Or, Get Out, the idea that like, they're just happy like this, like they just get the right body and then they're happy because they're younger. Like, I find that much more disturbing than we turn you into a robot and then throw away the old you.
Well, I'm going to tell you, when I show it to my gender studies class, they would all disagree with you. They find that to be really, really horrifying. And maybe part of it is they're younger and they don't know this story. And maybe part of it is they're in a gender studies class, so we're thinking about the way gender is shaped. But it's just interesting. Like, I just know when I show it, my students have such a different reaction to it than the way we talk about it. They see it with fresh eyes and it still freaks them out like 40 years later, for what it's worth.
What part of it did they respond the most sort of viscerally to?
The very end, when all the women are shopping and they're all wearing those low cut dresses. And they're like, because at that point they've studied 200 years of feminism and they're like, oh my God, it's this reversion back to these Victorian ideas, but made into Playboy sexy. Mm-hmm. And they're just freaked out by that. So for them, it's that ending, just everything sort of comes together. Like, it really builds and it works for them in a lot of surprising ways. And of course, they're all sad when the dog disappears too, because they're sentimental.
Yeah, don't mess with dogs.
Oh, yeah.
But, that's one of those things, though, that I always thought was really horrifying about the 90s is sort of the normalizing of porn and this sort of way the mainstream really bullied people into, hey, man, it's cool. Don't be so uptight. This is all, these strip clubs are cool. You're going to the strip club ironically. And it was this idea that these sort of like, that real actual human beings were supposed to be sexually aroused by almost robots, people with implants and a certain look and airbrushing and intense camera ready makeup and all this. So, I mean, that makes sense. That was almost like replacing women with sex droids.
Yeah.
Well, because I thought I had seen the Stepford Wives, I don't know, a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago, something like that. And I thought I remembered it pretty well. But the detail, to your point, Grady, that stuck out the most in my mind is when the main character, when she sees that her robot replacement, that its voluptuousness has been very visibly enhanced.
Actually, my students always notice that too. Yeah, it really freaks them out. And the lack of the pupils. She loses her pupils. She has no eyes anymore that are like windows to the soul. They're just these alien holes.
Well, and also because she's a photographer, that was everything she did that made her unique. That was her art and her career.
Yeah.
And just that, but I'd forgotten the fact that when she finds her robot double, that it's in a replica of her bedroom back at her house.
Right.
It's just a detail that like really I found unsettling and kind of mystifying. But I guess it's to habituate the robot to its eventual home, but yeah, because there's the scene where the guys they seem to be like examining the bedroom, the men's club, and I was like, what's going on? Even knowing them, even having watched the movie before, I'm like, what is going on here?
Well, I mean, all turned into Playboy bunnies.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's it. This is the height of the Playboy Club. This is right when Gloria Steinem was exposing what was going on in the Playboy Club. And that's what happens in the movie. Visually, it very much, they're remade as Playboy bunnies.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and one thing that's also, I mean, I think a part of the horror, too, is that, and I always thought the movie and the book, too, don't make as much of it as I wish they did, but they kind of can't because of the way the mechanics of the plot work, is that their husbands acquiesce to this. You know, they have that great scene in the movie where the husband comes back from the first meeting and he just wants to get sloppy drunk. It's like he's seen something horrifying that he rejects totally. And then he gives into it and this idea that your husband, that your spouse, that your partner only wants you as a compliant body, I think is such a betrayal. That I think that's really part of the heart of that movie and book.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's why I'm, as much as I didn't necessarily love the movie, I'm pro-robot and pro-murder in the sense that I think that really emphasizes the horror of it and how, you know, you sort of, I mean, that you do see that they're bothered by the decision initially, and then they very quickly adapt to it. Not just the main character's husband, but also at one point somebody else is replaced, and you see that the husband is just like a complete wreck in the car. He's like being driven home, but within a day or two, he's adapted to this idea. And when you know that this isn't just something you can rationalize away as a personality change or something, but it's literal murder and replacement by robots, I think that gives it real dramatic force when you realize what the husbands are doing to them.
Well, let me ask you, Anthony, do you like I'm saying about the Burbs, do you feel like the Stepford Wives needs like an extra twist or two, since you found it pretty predictable, I guess, or?
Yeah, but I mean, it's sort of, I can't necessarily fault it for that. It's more saying that it's sort of hard for me to watch it with fresh eyes because it's been, at least to me, in the culture so much that I feel like I know the twist already. And that's not necessarily a fault of the movie. Maybe it's a fault of the movie that I didn't find as much to enjoy, even knowing the twist. But I wouldn't necessarily, it seems unfair to penalize it for having such a good twist that, 40, 50 years later, I know what it is.
Because I feel like, watching all these movies together, I mean, I feel like, and I as I said, I liked the Stepford Wives a lot, but I feel like Get Out is just clearly like head and shoulders above all these other movies. And I feel like maybe it has all the social commentary, and everything that, it's funny, it's scary and everything, but it also has the right number of twists too, that, even having watched it a few years ago, there was still a twist. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that, but that's really clever how that was set up. And I just feel like the ending is basically just perfect. And so I would say I agree with you to the extent that I think that Get Out as a plot, just sort of like works a little bit better than the Stepford Wives, in terms of having more surprises.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Although, yeah, I saw Get Out when it came out, and I haven't seen it since. So obviously, Get Out had a big advantage in that. But I do remember that it is just kind of, well, it's also structured a little differently too, in the sense that I think the reveal comes a little bit earlier in the film. The fundamental reveal of the horror of what is happening and this body replacement. And so you have like a whole act of the film that's about letting the ramifications of that play out. And I do think I find that more dramatically satisfying than essentially revealing that they're robots right at the end of the movie and then, fairly shortly after that, ending the film.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Lisa, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I see that too. I love Get Out. I think it's an amazing movie. And, of course, part of it is it has Jordan Peele, but it also has the advantage of having this huge history of all these other wonderful movies behind it that it can sort of work off of. But I really like what Anthony's saying about the way it plays out in some more detail that feels compelling and interesting. And I too love the ending. I was so relieved to have that ending and not the ending that I thought I saw coming.
Yes.
And if any of you have seen Attack the Block, which is actually another movie we talked about, right? Because I love Attack the Block, but the ending just breaks my heart when the kids get thrown in jail after everything they've done to defend their estate against alien invasion, and then they get blamed for everything. I was happy that Get Out decided not to do that ending. I think I had read that originally they were going to do the more pessimistic ending, where all the black people end up dead or in trouble. And they chose not to because they're like, for once, wouldn't it be nice if the black people won? And I agree 100%.
Yeah. And when I rented it, it said, stick around after the credits to watch the alternate ending. And I was like, no, I'm not doing that. I don't want to see it.
I haven't ever watched the alternate ending either. I didn't even know there was one recorded.
Yeah. So I think absolutely the theatrical ending is the way to go. I wouldn't want the movie to end any other way than that.
But I thought it was a great movie. I love that, that in the end, the thing that allows our protagonist to sort of shift the power dynamics and get free is cotton, right? That a black man uses cotton against white people. That's funny because he pulls all the cotton stuffing out of the chair and plugs his ears. So I just thought I'd make that point, that I think it's great that it turns on cotton.
And that the hero who rides to the rescue is the TSA.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. 100%. That was amazing.
Well, and it's I think it was Grady who pointed out that the main characters are both photographers in Get Out and Stepford Wives. And that makes me wonder if Jordan Peele was sort of explicitly, referencing Stepford Wives.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, one of the things that Lisa said is that, one of the reasons Get Out works so well is it does have this huge tradition to pull on. Think of how many people refer to people as a Stepford Wives or something Stepford, and they may not have even seen the movie or read the book. Yeah, or pod people, exactly. It's really in the pop culture. And Jordan Peele's a huge horror movie fan. I'm sure he's pretty conversant with Stepford Wives.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if there are other reasons, sort of thematic or reasons to make the characters photographers,
photography is about capturing an ideal moment, right? That may or may not map to the messiness of reality. And it certainly seems in both those movies, no one wants the messiness of real lived relations, right? They want these fairy tales.
Yeah,
I guess just youth, eternal sexiness, Yeah.
Also, just from a plot standpoint, it turns out that a camera flash will sort of disrupt the mind, overpowering.
Yeah,
and so maybe just making him a photographer also makes that a little bit more, natural, that he would, the camera would kind of be his salvation.
Well, also, there is an element where, and this is really, honestly, I need to start drinking or something just to shut up. But there is an element where suburbs are a snapshot, this idealized snapshot of life. Those houses aren't supposed to age. They're supposed to always be new. There's always supposed to be kids playing in the driveway. It's what's the place in The Wrinkle in Time? Kamazats, which is that when they go to the planet that it rules, Meg sees there's a perfect suburb and all these little girls come out of the front doors and start to jump rope all at the same time, all in unison.
Yes.
Photos are supposed to be perfect forever, and so are subdivisions or suburbs.
Yeah.
And I want to get Anthony back in here, but that just reminds me quickly. I just want to say that another observation I had about Stepford Wives versus Get Out that I thought was interesting was that in Stepford Wives, the sinister community makes no pretense of being enlightened. They have an explicit men's club that excludes women, and they come to the main character's house and just all kind of talk amongst themselves and don't involve her in the conversation. Whereas in Get Out, the people have this real sort of patronizing, sort of superficial compliment. They're superficially complimentary toward Chris the whole time, but in this very alienating way because it's so othering.
Yeah.
And I thought that that was Get Out was a little bit more sophisticated, or maybe just contemporary in that way of how people, sort of have this pretense of being enlightened, but aren't actually.
Actually, Dave, you've seen the movie more recently than I have. Is there a single non-white actor in the whole thing?
In Stepford Wives?
Stepford Wives, yeah.
Yes. At the very end, the new couple being lured in is a black couple, right, Dave?
Right.
Am I remembering that right?
Right.
No, you're
Yes.
right. Yes, yes,
Mhm.
yes.
And it's very
Thank you.
aggressively, they're like, oh, yes, we could be a diverse neighborhood.
Yeah,
Oh,
you're
yeah,
right.
so I guess
Okay,
that is in
thank you.
Stepford Wives after. I'd forgotten, yeah, but there's the scene. There's a scene even before that where one of the people says, "Oh, when we have a black couple moving to town, we're so progressive." So yeah, actually, that actually undercuts my whole point. But yeah,
Sorry.
so giving Stepford Wives more credit than it. I'm not giving it enough credit, I guess. But yeah, but I do want to get back to Anthony. Anthony, do you have any thoughts about just anything we've been saying?
Yeah, I mean, that actually ties into my thought, which also was kind of, I think it's been kind of bouncing around in my head as we've been talking about all these things, which is the question of, if we talk about suburban horror as being about something inherently suburban, right? Not just a setting. I wonder to what extent it also becomes trapped in this very narrow idea of what the suburbs is, right? That Grady was talking at the beginning, that it's all people of the same income level, usually people of the same ethnicity. It's people in very traditional gender roles, and not to say that those things don't exist in the suburbs, but it also makes me wonder about the fact that, a suburb of 2020 is different from the suburb of 1970, and in trying to capture this sort of horror of conformity and whiteness, does like a suburban horror film also risk, actually portraying a suburb that is sort of increasingly not the suburb that exists now? Or maybe conversely, like, are there ways in which these films can still be contemporary and different from the suburban horror film of that era? And so you pointed out one of in Get Out, where it is, the sort of horror is masked a little bit more and like cloaked in different language. I also think about, I watched The Purge for the first time. And that was one where it captures a lot of this horror, and race is certainly an element of it, which I think gets played up even more in the sequels. But one of the things that did feel more contemporary to me was the fact that actually in this little subdivision where everyone's murdering everyone else, it's actually fairly racially diverse. I mean, they're all like affluent, but that it's not just the sort of 50s white household that we imagine, that the horrors of the suburb are still there, but they kind of take on slightly more contemporary forms.
Yeah, well, what you're saying is reminding me that there was this thing I wanted to come back to, which is that is sort of criticizing the suburbs sort of trite at this point. Grady was mentioning John Cheever and all this stuff. I mean, I just feel like there's been half a century or more of sort of reinforcing this message that the suburbs are kind of sterile and conformist and all this stuff. And, does anyone not know that by now? Like, do we need to keep reinforcing that point, or do we? I mean, maybe we do, but I wanted to just raise that question.
Well, I was just going to say, within the first 8 years of suburban developments spreading across America, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street was on the Twilight Zone. So it really was right at the beginning. People were already critiquing suburbs and what they meant.
Yeah. Well, Lisa, you had recommended Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, right? Is there anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, right. Well, I think that actually what's really interesting is to think about not just the original, but also is it the 2000 remake, which was right after 9/11.
Yeah.
It's a really very interesting remake because it's very much engaging there. Instead of it being aliens kind of screwing with us, it's the government purposely running a test on people. And the trigger is they drop a family of color into a white neighborhood, and it all proceeds from there. And so this time the aliens, or the monsters are, they seem to be this Middle Eastern family, but it's really our government sort of trying to manipulate people's raced feelings about things in the suburbs. So maybe you're right that we're thinking more about issues of color in the suburbs. I know that there was a big study done about this in 2012, I think, 2015. Where they found that more and more that the suburbs in theory are getting more diverse, like more people of color are moving out, but they remain economically stratified, and that not all suburbs are necessarily created equal. Maybe it ties into that. I don't know where this is going here. Like Grady, it's time to start drinking, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I haven't seen that 2000 remake.
I haven't either. I've forgotten now.
Oh, it's really good. I highly recommend it. Yeah, it's cool.
But I the original, if people haven't seen it, basically the premise is that there's this neighborhood and the electricity, like cars are starting and stopping and lights are going on and off in weird ways, and the people become convinced that there are aliens among them, and some of them maybe are aliens, and in the end they all freak out and kind of chaos ensues. And then there's an epilogue where these aliens say, look, humans are so stupid, all you have to do is turn the car on and off and they'll destroy each other. And
Yeah.
it's very explicitly a sort of critique of Red Scare, kind of,
Right.
McCarthyism.
Yeah. Oh,
and-
this one is definitely the remake is really engaging the sort of racism that was targeted at Middle Eastern people after 9/11.
Yeah, no, I'll have to check that out. But yeah, so I was wondering if, I don't know if Rod Serling was sort of explicitly responding to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the kind of interpretation, I mean, I guess you could say, I think Robert Heinlein's Puppet Masters is a very similar premise, and I think that one was explicitly intended as a, the pod people or the aliens are communists,
Right. And how much are all of those works of art responding to the one-dimensional man, right? That sociological study by, was it Marcuse, I think, which was all about the way that modern society and especially middle-class suburban life was flattening people and turning them one-dimensional. So it was in the air at that time.
Mm-hmm. See, Anthony, were there any other movies or books or anything that you wanted to mention?
No, I think we covered everything that I watched. I mean, I would just throw in a recommendation for The Purge. I think it's James DeMonaco, who both wrote and directed, I think is a much better director than he is a writer, but it's a great concept and executed really well. And I was on the edge of my seat for most of the running time.
Yeah, no, I thought it was pretty good. I don't remember it super well, but I remember I think I liked it pretty well. Couple other things on the list that we haven't touched on yet: Halloween, Disturbia, Poltergeist, Nightmare on Elm Street. Grady, any of those you think are worth highlighting here?
I mean, how many hours do we have? It's, Halloween's a weird one, but like Nightmare on Elm Street and Poltergeist, they're both about, one of the things with suburbs and HOAs and subdivisions and this sort of controlling your neighborhood is this idea that like, we're going to write the narrative of this landscape, right? This is a place for these kind of people, and we made these kind of laws and things look this way. We're curating this history. These are new houses and all this. And I think Poltergeist and Nightmare on Elm Street are both, movies that say, no, history doesn't begin where you say it begins. There's crimes in the past that have been buried. And that's always when we look at a suburb now. I think, like Lisa was saying earlier, we bring this whole history of critique in these stories because it's not the critique. No one reads an academic essay and thinks about that when they look at a suburb, unless you're probably one of us. But you hear these stories all your life, and these stories shape how we look at suburbs. So whenever we look at a suburb now, we're like, what are we not seeing? What's this built on top of? It's called Deer Hollow. Was there a nice hollow full of deers that are now paved over? Like, we just instantly see a suburb and imagine what it's covering up.
Can you explain to me, you mentioned Halloween, I think. I don't remember it that well, but I would have said just off the top of my head that was a psycho who just incidentally happened to be in the suburbs rather than suburban horror. But is there some other sort of deeper level of that I'm forgetting?
The only deeper level to it, because I would agree, I would think Nightmare on Elm Street or Poltergeist deal with it more explicitly. But the other level, though, of Halloween is there, which is that this is a family whose kid murdered the babysitter, and they sent him away, and no one says boo about it anymore. Like, they got rid of that inconvenience and they just merged right back in. Because I think they're still in the same neighborhood. The old Myers house is like a block away from where the family lives now, or where Jamie Lee Curtis lives now, who later we find out is his sister. So this idea that you can just erase the past by covering it up in these suburbs, I think is in there, but much less than in the other movies.
Mm-hmm. How about Lisa? Are you into these sort of movies like Poltergeist, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween?
I've seen them all. And I think that Grady just summed it up really well, how to think about them. I don't know that I have anything more to add to it than that.
Uh-huh.
I do remember watching Halloween as a kid, and we lived in the suburbs of Detroit. And I remember thinking just that, like, it mapped pretty easily. Do you know what I mean? So at least for me as a kid, and I saw it far too young, like 7 or 8 or something at a party. So Halloween to me did feel like it was about the suburbs, simply because the setting, and again, I was very small and I haven't seen it again since then, but it left a real impression on me. That setting did scare the heck out of me when I was very little. What it would do for me now as an adult, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But Halloween because Halloween is like a thing in the suburbs, right? And again, there's that tension between the picture perfectness of it and the dangers of it. Oh, and especially in the 70s, you guys, like, I don't know if any of you grew up then or remember it, but there were all these scares about Halloween, right? That
yes.
supposedly people were putting needles and poison in the candy. So all of a sudden Halloween became this really terrifying thing. And like we would go trick or treating and we couldn't eat our candy until like we went over to the hospital and they x-rayed it to make sure there were no needles in it. And I mean, it was like, so I realized that's not quite the same as like Mike Myers and having someone like chase you around. But I think that same idea that Halloween looks like it's this fun, sweet children's activity. And then there's all this other sort of potential danger and horror around it. And the fact that the Halloween movie came out while those Halloween scares were happening seems fortuitous.
Yeah. The emergency room where I grew up, they would x-ray your candy on Halloween, razor blades and apples.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up, I was like 3 years old in 1980, so I don't remember the 70s particularly, but certainly when I was in the early 80s when I was a kid, that was a big thing still in terms of Halloween.
So it lasted a while.
Yeah, same in like mid to late 80s for me.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, was that a specifically suburban phenomenon, or like did people in the country or people in the city have the
suburban?
I think it was suburban. Yeah. I think it was suburban.
And it's crazy when you think about it, because if you're a kid trick-or-treating, you have a pretty limited radius. Like, what is your walking distance while dressed as a witch? Like, and the idea that within that radius of like a mile and a half of your house, there's some sicko who's put like poison or razor blades, an apple. Like, you don't know what these people get up to behind their doors. I mean, it's a really paranoid notion.
It is.
Well, and it's not like the person, like there was a thing that happens where someone poisoned Tylenol bottles.
Yes.
Right.
But it's not like, I remember who gave me this apple, like, like, how would you possibly get away with it? Which is, why there was never any cases.
But I think,
it
was not true. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think for some people, like I think like thinking back on it, isn't that a weird way of your parents telling you, I really hate and don't trust these neighbors? Like the ones you see me smiling at every day, I think they're freaks. Like, I don't like them. Like it's
that wasn't
weird.
My parents. That was other kids at school trying to scare you before Halloween. For me.
Oh, my parents did it. Maybe they just wanted to scare us.
Oh, mine too.
No. So, but yeah, you're right. It does sort of, I hadn't thought about that, but that is interesting. I have no idea. I mean, I personally have no desire to live in the suburbs, but, and perhaps it was because of things like that, but, I don't know.
Well, I was going to ask, like, how do you guys feel about living in the suburbs, and has watching these movies affected your view of living in the suburbs in any way?
Oh, these movies are directly about where I grew up. Like, I saw Poltergeist, and that mapped right onto my house, right onto the trees outside my window, right onto my toys. It was crazy. But, it's one of those things, too, that like, you look at suburbs and they're happy and everyone gets along and it's a community. But if you live there, you know who's suing who and who's not talking to who and who doesn't let their child leave. Like, that stuff. You know what I mean? Like, you see it. And so to see that reflected in the movies is tremendously validating.
I mean, I guess I know Grady and Anthony both live in New York City. Anthony, you think you'll ever end up in the suburbs?
I doubt it very much. I grew up in suburban Los Angeles, and I felt very strongly that I had to leave, and that it was, that living my adult life was partly about escaping the suburbs. And certainly, this year I think has opened up that conversation a little bit more, in the sense of, you watch any of these movies and you're just like, oh, a backyard. They're not just trapped in their tiny apartments. That doesn't really seem so bad in the grand scheme of things. But no, I think in general, like, my commitment to New York is firm.
How about Lisa? I don't actually know. Lisa, do you live
I'm
in the
Atlanta.
city? Or?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So I had a similar, I think, experience to Anthony, although north-south instead of east-west. I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, and yes, I would say that much of my life from about 8 years old on was devoted to figuring out how to get out of the suburbs. I remember taking long walks to see if I could somehow get away from the rows and rows of houses, because we were at the very
and then it was like
suburb.
Vivarium, where you just kept coming back to the same house.
a little bit, but there was sort of this hope, because my family had moved to the very outer suburbs of Detroit, and so actually you can literally walk out of the suburbs and into countryside if you walk long enough. I mean, you got to go for miles, but it's doable. So, and I remember doing those walks, hoping, I don't know where I thought I would end up, Ann Arbor or something, I guess. Anything would have been better. But yeah, and then now, of course, I'm in Atlanta and firmly in the city. You could not be more in the city than we are, which is wonderful. The nice thing, though, I have to say, and this is maybe a difference I have from those of you who are in New York, is, Atlanta is a city of trees. And not only do I really have a backyard, even though I'm right downtown, we have 7 acres of common property. I basically live on a park. So it's kind of been, for us, pretty good in lockdown, because we've actually had green space. Having said that, I would never, ever, ever move to the suburbs, especially not in Atlanta. I don't need to send my kid to a school where they teach creationism, where they do creationism instead of evolution. Right now in Atlanta, the public schools are all online, sensibly, for the fall, but up in the suburbs, they're agitating to put all the kids back in classes because they don't want to teach their kids at home. And I don't know. It just feels to me like everything that's kind of wrong about the suburbs right there. Just this, right? All these things we're talking about, the conformity and the groupthink, and things have to stay the same and things can't change. And whether or not that's true, I mean, maybe people are having wonderful, rich, fulfilling lives up in those suburbs. They probably are. The houses are gorgeous. But I don't want to do it.
All right, so we're pretty much out of time. So why don't we get into some final thoughts here? So Grady, any other final thoughts on this whole subject of suburban horror?
No, the only 2 quick things I would say is, 3 things. Sorry, I'll make them fast. One is that I do think Blue Velvet is really interesting because it sells the appeal of the suburbs as like, oh, if you dig beneath the surface, everything is hell and people are just unchained appetites. And so the suburbs make sense. Like this kind of peacefulness it's desirable. There's also a really great book by Elizabeth Holding called The Blank Wall. It's been made into a movie, I think, before, but it's from the 40s, and it's about a woman living in the suburbs while her husband's fighting World War II, and she has to cover up a murder. And the whole theme of it is just sort of like how enmeshed you are in everyone's lives. And like, she doesn't have time. Like, oh my God, I've got to do all that. I've got to cook. I've got to clean. I do all this stuff and cover up a murder. What are you talking about? It's been reissued. It's really great. And then the last thing I was going to say, just because Lisa, you were saying you lived in Atlanta, or you live in Atlanta. I love this thing that was on AMC a couple of years ago called Black Summer. It's a super duper cheap zombie thing. I mean, it is cheap, like really cheap, but they shoot it all in the suburbs of Atlanta. And like, I was addicted to it. It's like, it's just people running from zombies, but the landscapes they move through are so authentically suburban, and they're walking.
I'll have to check it out.
They're walking everywhere. So you see how suburb gives way to industrial area, which gives way to downtown. Mm-hmm. It's really fascinating, but it's a suburb, not as a cultural construct, but just simply as a landscape. And I thought it was hypnotic.
Oh, I'll have to check that out. Definitely then. It must have been interesting, especially since The Walking Dead is set around Atlanta and then the suburbs and the countryside as well.
It was uglier, cheaper Walking Dead. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Excellent. I have to check that out.
Well, no, but that was one insight that came out of Walking Dead, is if there's a zombie apocalypse, Atlanta's a good place to be because the CDC is right there. You just swing by and get your zombie vaccine or something.
Well, given how well the early corona testing kits worked from the CDC, I'm not sure how well that's going to pan out for anyone. But it's a good theory, definitely.
Actually, my girlfriend Steph, one of her friends, said, they're implementing this COVID-19 vaccine in Russia now with minimal testing. Mm-hmm. And one of her friends said, I know this is how the zombie apocalypse starts.
Yeah, that sounds right. Mm-hmm.
Lisa, any other final thoughts?
Yeah. So, if I can just, can we leave the realm of art and venture very quickly, just dip my toe in the realm of politics? I would point out that we're talking about like suburban horror, and the rhetoric of suburban horror has been in the news quite a bit lately because Donald Trump has been attempting to mobilize that language, right, to scare what he thinks are these white suburban homesteaders, right? So he's been talking a lot about how he's going to sign executive orders to make sure that you can't have low-income housing in middle-class neighborhoods, right? Because there's going to be this invasion. And ever since Biden announced Kamala Harris as his running mate, he's been tweeting again about her and Cory Booker as overseeing an invasion of the suburbs. And I think that that's very interesting to think about how that rhetoric from these movies is getting mobilized right now in a political context.
Yeah.
Well, and how much probably his idea of the suburbs comes from maybe not these movies, but movies like it, rather than any direct experience of what the suburbs are like in 2020.
That does seem to be the case, yeah.
He's never lived in a suburb in his life.
No.
Anthony, any other final thoughts?
No, I don't think I can top that. So, well, actually, no, I take it back. I would, going back into the realm of art slightly, but also tagging off of that is, I would love to see, and maybe this exists and I just haven't seen it yet, but I would just love to see more suburban horror that actually reflects contemporary suburbs and how they've changed, and rather than sort of this imagined 50s suburb, which, Dave, to your point, I do agree, there's a certain tiredness of being like, yes, like that's terrible. Find more that's terrible about the suburbs of today.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And the only thing I'll add is just, again, I actually really liked all these suburban horror movies. So if you haven't seen any of these that we talked about, definitely go check them out because I really enjoyed all of them. And yeah, we're going to have to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Grady Hendrix, Anthony Ha, and Lisa Yaszek. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you.
See you in the suburbs.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Grady Hendrix, Anthony Ha, and Lisa Yaszek for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. I also want to thank Berkeley for sponsoring today's show. Learn more about their new novel, The Mother Code by Carol Stivers, over at carolstivers.com. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.